Imagine your entire life flashing before your eyes, every action, every word coming back to haunt you. Now add a hungry demon that's just waiting to devour your soul. This is just a small taste of what ancient Egyptians believed would happen right after you die. They weren't satisfied with a quick trip to the afterlife. No, they wanted all the details, and they planned for their existence to continue even after their bodies gave out. For the Egyptians, death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey, and they wanted to be prepared for eternity. To understand ancient Egypt, you need to understand their obsession with the afterlife. It wasn't just a belief for them, it was their future. And if you want to learn what happens after we die, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to my channel. Today, let's explore how the ancient Egyptians prepared themselves for eternity. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. The eternal journey begins. The ancient Egyptians lived in a region that seemed blessed by the gods. The Nile River flowed through the land like an emerald ribbon, providing enough water and soil to make the desert bloom and creating one of the richest civilizations in the ancient world. But this fertility had its own dark side. As long as the Nile kept giving them food, the Egyptians could keep on having kids without worrying about running out of resources. In fact, it was partly because of the abundance of food that they began to obsess over sex, death, and what came next. Since life was so good down here, they wanted to know what awaited them in the great beyond. The best way to think of the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife is that they essentially had an eternity insurance policy. They knew there would be a payout at some point and they wanted to be prepared. For example, nobody in the ancient world understood the science of human decomposition. So people everywhere feared that dead bodies would reanimate as ghouls and go on murderous rampages. However, when the Egyptians learned to preserve human bodies through mummification, they grew less afraid of dead bodies and more interested in what happened after someone died. Unlike many other cultures of the time, the Egyptians didn't have an oral tradition. Their written language was pictographic, and they took pains to record every aspect of their culture, including their religious beliefs and burial rituals. This means that we have most of their stories about the afterlife written down in tombs and on temple walls, unlike many other cultures whose myths are only known through the accounts of outsiders. This includes everything from myths about the underworld to instructions for properly preparing a corpse for burial. Now let's take a closer look at what those burial rituals entailed, starting with mummification. Mummification wasn't just a way to preserve a body. It was a multi-stage process intended to prepare the body for immortality. This is obvious when you look at what they did to the brain. During mummification, the brain was seen as unimportant, since the Egyptians believed that it controlled the body while the person was alive. But it was unnecessary once the soul moved on. They simply pulled it out through the nose. Other organs were treated differently. The Egyptians believed that the heart was the source of wisdom and emotions. They considered it a sacred organ and never removed it unless a person had done something truly evil in life, such as murdering someone, in which case the heart was handed over to Ammit, the goddess who judged the dead in the Hall of Truth. Internal organs, like the lungs, stomach and intestines, were removed and placed in canopic jars. These jars were usually decorated with the face of one of the 12 gods who protected the dead on their journey. Each god had his or her own responsibilities. For example, the god Imsidi watched over the liver. The Egyptians believed that this was important because the liver had the ability to renew itself. So it was a symbol of everlasting life. The kidneys were placed in a jar guarded by the jackal-headed god Duemutif. He symbolized purification because the kidneys filtered toxins out of the blood. The stomach was placed in a jar bearing the head of the baboon god Hapi. Hapi represented fertility and abundance, so he ensured that the deceased would never go hungry in the afterlife. Finally, the intestines were placed in a jar decorated with the human-headed baboon god, Jufu, his name meant to protect, and he ensured that the deceased would be safe on their journey. Once the organs were placed in the canopic jars, they were sealed with resin and buried near the coffin. Once the body was ready, it was wrapped in layers of bandages soaked in resin and tucked into a stone coffin. Sometimes precious objects were placed inside the coffin, such as jewelry or statues of gods. These items were meant to provide comfort and protection during the long journey ahead. Many coffins were covered with spells and prayers. Some of these were general protective spells, while others were specific instructions for guiding the deceased through the underworld. One of the most famous collections of burial texts is the pyramid texts. These were inscribed on the walls of pyramids during the 5th and 6th dynasties. around 2400 BC. They contained spells and hymns that were designed to help the pharaoh navigate the underworld and reach the field of reeds. The coffin texts were similar to the pyramid texts, except they were found on coffins rather than pyramid walls. These texts date back to the 4th dynasty, around 2680 BC, and they were probably used during the New Kingdom, around 1543 to 1292 BC, like the pyramid texts. They contained spells and hymns to help the deceased navigate the underworld. Together, these texts are known as the Book of the Dead. They're not actually a single book, but a collection of spells and texts that were designed to help the dead on their journey through the underworld. Different people had different versions of the book depending on their social status and wealth. Wealthy people could afford more elaborate texts with more spells, while poorer people had simpler texts. Despite their differences, all versions of the book included instructions for mummification, burial rituals, and the journey through the underworld. Weighing of the heart. Once the burial was complete, the Egyptians believed that the soul would travel to the underworld and face a series of tests. The first test was called the weighing of the heart. It took place in the Hall of Truth and was overseen by Anubis, the god of the dead, and Thoth, the god of wisdom. During the ceremony, the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of justice, representing Mat, the goddess of truth and balance. If the heart was lighter than the feather, it meant that the person had lived a good life and their soul would be allowed to move on to the field of reeds. If the heart was heavier than the feather, it meant that the person had lived a bad life and was unworthy of entering the field of reeds. Instead, their heart was handed over to Ammit, the goddess who devoured the hearts of the unworthy dead. Those whose hearts were eaten by Ammit were sent to the underworld, where they were tortured for eternity. This might sound scary, but the Egyptians believed that it was necessary to ensure that only the purest souls entered the field of reeds. The field of reeds was a paradise located in the underworld where the dead could spend eternity in peace. It was filled with all the pleasures that the Egyptians had enjoyed in life, such as delicious food, beautiful women, and endless parties. The Egyptians believed that it was a reward for those who had lived good lives and their hearts had been pure. However, not everyone was destined to enter the field of reeds. Those who had lived bad lives and their hearts had been heavy were condemned to spend eternity in the underworld. There they were tortured by demons and prevented from finding peace. Beyond the Duat, although the Egyptians believed that the afterlife was full of wonder and excitement, they also knew that it was dangerous. That's why they took such great pains to prepare themselves for what lay ahead. They wanted to make sure that their souls would be protected and guided through the perilous journey. But what did they believe would happen when their souls reached the end of the Duat? Where would they go? What would they do? And how would they spend eternity? For the Egyptians, the afterlife was an extension of life on earth. They believed that it was a place where they could continue to grow, learn, and evolve. They didn't see death as an ending, but as a transition to a new and better existence. This is evident in the Egyptian creation myth. According to this myth, the world had already been destroyed and recreated several times before, and would continue to be destroyed and recreated indefinitely. Each time the world was destroyed, the sun god Ra emerged from the primordial waters and created a new race of humans. He then breathed life into them and sent them forth to live on the earth. The Egyptians believed that this cycle would continue indefinitely. They saw the universe as a never-ending series of births, deaths, and rebirths. The goal of each individual was to achieve enlightenment and break free from this cycle. This could only be done by living a life of virtue and wisdom, and then successfully navigating the underworld. Once the soul reached the end of the Duat, it would be greeted by Osiris, the god of the underworld. Osiris was seen as a benevolent ruler who welcomed the dead with open arms. He helped them to find their place in the afterlife, and guided them to the field of reeds. The field of reeds was a place of peace and tranquility where the dead could enjoy all the pleasures that life had to offer. It was a paradise where there was no pain, no suffering, and no death. The Egyptians believed that it was the ultimate destination for all souls, not just those who had lived good lives. In fact, they believed that even the wicked could find peace in the field of reeds, if they were able to successfully navigate the underworld. This shows that the Egyptians were as concerned with punishing the wicked as they were with helping the dead to find peace.